Welcome, everybody. I'm here with Remer, who reached out to me recently after he had seen my debate with political live streamer Vaush. And his big takeaway was y'all got in a disagreement about the specifics of the facts of the lead up to World War II and the specifics of kind of the rise of fascism with the Nazi party in Germany. And Vaush was off. I didn't make that many bold statements, so there weren't really on that particular subject. I tried to be honest and say, I don't know if I want to talk real confidently about this because I don't know if I'm read up enough on the history to make those claims. And then Remer had said he's heard a lot of other people kind of misread out the details of that time. And so reached out saying it'd be cool to have a discussion where we go through what Vaush got wrong, go through the gaps in knowledge he's seen with other people. And I obviously thought that'd be a really cool idea. And then the big primary reason for it is recently, with the big F word, fascism, being thrown around constantly when being applied to current American politics, it's important for us to understand the era that is the most known for that clear fascism being in place is probably not as well understood as it should be if we're going to be now comparing it to elements of our own moment here and now. So, Remer, before we get into any of that, you want to just introduce yourself, kind of what led you to wanting to have this discussion?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So my name is Remer, as mentioned. I want to clarify for the audience, I am not a historian. I'm someone who's passionate about history and I read a lot about it, but I'm not a professional historian. I'm not educated in history. My degrees were in economics, but it's something that I still find interesting. And so after watching the Vaush debate and watching, Luke, who's a great political streamer here, and then also Vaush get into some of the nuances and details of the rise of Nazism and seeing some sort of factual errors, I just thought it'd be interesting to talk to Luke and maybe equip him for future conversations. And he suggested maybe also equip the audience. So here I am.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's an interesting little note, is that initially Remer was like, hey, we can offline have a discussion about this. And I was like, no, let's do it for everyone to hear because it is so important. And as I said, and as we'll kind of keep pointing to throughout the rest of the conversation, it is something that is being referenced so often. And that was the sense that I got, even though, again, I wasn't trying to make claims that I was the expert. I still was like, from my understanding of that part of history, the conversations that I'm hearing are not right. They're not accurate. So I'm super excited. Okay. So you want to kind of lay out what the big points were that you took away and then how we're going to break it down?
Yeah. So if we want to take three main takeaways from this debate, where I think some of the narrative that was discussed on your debate differed from the historical record. The three main takeaways would probably be one, there's continuous reference to the need for violent resistance and political assassinations is the only way to stop the rise of fascism. And if only they'd done it in Nazi Germany, then you would have stopped Hitler, you would have stopped the Nazis. The reality is that in the Weimar Republic, so that's the interwar period Germany, so after the Imperial Germany in World War I and before World War II, one of the defining characteristics of the Weimar Republic was street violence, was political assassinations and resistance between basically the communists, the socialists / Sockdems, and the Nazis. And this instability actually fed and gave rise in part to the Nazis. The second key point we'll get through, we're going to kind of hit on as we go through this discussion, is going to be that the Nazis did in fact take power legitimately. We'll get into how that works when Vaush was correct to say they only got 37 and 32% of the vote in the fair elections, but they went through and captured power through legal means, in part campaigning on restoring order and ending the street violence. And the third thing, which is an interesting point, is one of the key things that really enabled the Nazis to rise was the decision of the communists, the KPD, and we'll get into these distinctions as well, basically treating the Social Democrats as the primary enemy. So they called them social fascists and looked at them as the primary opposition rather than the Nazis. So yeah, these are kind of the three main takeaways as we have this discussion, but we'll kind of talk through the history and some of the important contextual and meta points as we go through.
Awesome. So the big thing there, guys, is that one of the center points of our debate about that moment in history was him making the claim that you as a liberal, speaking to me, are the exact brand that allowed the Nazi Party to take power because you, played cover or, allowed them to take over without responding in a level of violent actions that would have stopped it. And what Remer pointed out just there was that actually in that time, violent clashes and violent uprising was very prevalent and was even a big part of the success of the Nazi Party, was to point at that and say, we can fix this current violence. And then, so fascinating, one of the things that one of the guys in chat who I have conversations with a lot, Jared, and I have discussed, is there's a lot of confusion around where do the Nazis sit, or where did they sit on an ideological spectrum? Because it seems like the left calls the right, the left calls like the far right comparable to the Nazi Party, and the right calls the far left comparable to the Nazi Party. And we're like, I don't even really know, were they super far left? Obviously they called themselves some kind of socialists at some point. So all of that I'm super excited to have cleared up.
Well, that actually leads me into one of my first meta points I wanted to talk about, was actually kind of understanding early socialism and the birth of fascism as an ideology. Because I think in the modern, especially in the modern American understanding, we have these really clear buckets, right? We think about communists as everyone who's USSR, socialists as some sort of vague identity of you want to seize the means of production, and you have democratic socialists and social democrats and fascists, right? And we have these very clear buckets. But I think if we roll the clock back, I think one of the big important things to understand is that when you look at the way the ideological landscape was framed and these terms were framed in, let's say, the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was somewhat different, right? So early socialism was essentially a hodgepodge of ideas. So under the blanket of kind of socialism, and you had the International Workers Association, the International, it's known as. This was kind of a big collective of various groups who viewed themselves as socialists because they viewed as the primary function of kind of increasing social welfare, who really had a whole slew of identities, right? So you had anarchists in there, you had kind of diehard Marxists, you had other forms of socialists, you had syndicalists, right? These are people who viewed that the committees and trade unions should be the center of power in society. And actually, interestingly, syndicalism is part of what gives birth to both what we think of later as Marxist-Leninist communism, as well as fascism, which is an interesting twist. Not to blame the syndicalists, so please, if anyone's a syndicalist in there, do not think that that's their fault, but those kind of power structures are part of what helped facilitate that. So in the beginning, you kind of have this very broad, almost broad tent socialist movement, and they define themselves, A, in wanting to advance workers' rights, and B, in opposition to the liberal order. And when I say liberal order, I don't mean the liberal in the American term, but more in the traditional sense, the laissez-faire order. So free markets, free people, that kind of thing. The free people part, many of the different groups were fine with, but the free markets was really the thing that they wanted to kind of combat against. And there's this kind of key breaking moment. Actually, one other piece of context is in this early order, Germany is sort of the global center of socialism, not just because Karl Marx is from Germany and he influenced a lot of the ideas that flew out of it, but also because Germany, we often think of it in the historical narrative, Imperial Germany is just like Imperial Russia, right? This absolute autocratic monarchy. And to some degree, that's true. But it was also semi-constitutional. It was a federal monarchy, and it had universal male suffrage. So all men over 25 could vote. You had a parliament, and they elected representatives. And after the anti-socialist laws disappeared in 1890, they elected the SPD, the Socialist Party, and we'll go through definitions later, but basically the broad tent Socialist Party, and they were the most powerful they were the most powerful party in the German parliament, and also the most powerful socialist power structure in the world at that point. So Germany was really viewed, it's also the most industrialized nation, viewed as the most advanced nation. It had some of the best workers' rights and protections. So at the outbreak of World War I, Germany is really viewed as the forefront and cutting edge and center of the socialist movement. And you have this major breaking point when World War I breaks out, because you have this kind of broad tent ideological party. And the socialists have to decide, do we view our struggle in the Marxist sense of we are all collectively as the working class fighting regardless of borders in our shared class values against the global capital structure, or are we also German or Italian or French or Russian? And so there was the kind of really the big moment that people look to is the vote the SPD, so the Socialist Party in Germany, had over whether or not to suspend essentially political struggle and show national unity in the face of the war. The, let's say, moderate to right end, so what we would consider today social democrats and these types of people, they all voted to kind of show unity and to understand this is an exceptional situation and we're all going to show solidarity in the face of this threat to the German nation. And the more left end voted against it and felt extremely betrayed in the ideals, because they said, we've all agreed that the nation state is unimportant. We are here for the fighting and the movement of workers, right? And this divide happened in many places. So this happened in the Russian socialist collective, this happened in the German one, and the French one, and the Italian one. And part of this divide is you start to see reactions to each other, right? So you start to see the anti-war socialists start to hate the pro-war socialists. And this creates a real kind of breakdown in that big tent unity. There's a quote from Mussolini, who interestingly, so Mussolini, for those, I assume you all know, but if you don't, he was the fascist dictator of Italy. He came to power in 1923, I want to say. So he was kind of one of the first fascist governments. He was originally a socialist as well. Now, I'm not saying fascists are socialists, so again, but I'm just giving context on the history because they're not.
Well, and also there's like, how do you market yourself, and then what are you actually trying to enact can make a big difference. That we do understand with a lot of things in history, the titles don't necessarily apply to the deeper held beliefs. But I will have you quickly lay out for us, because we're going to talk a lot about fascism, or we are talking about fascism. What do you think makes, because every time I've done reading up on it, it's a pretty vague term. What do you think makes fascism? What specific characteristics for any old person to look at a set of situations in a country and say that is fascistic, or that is an actual fascist government?
That's a great question. I would say the common threads you see across what are true fascist governments, right? The things that are consistent are going to be a strong sense of ethno-nationalism, right? So a strong sense of not just nationalism, but also your ethnic identity tied to your national identity.
Right.
Now, this is more understandable in the old world, where you have kind of ethnic peoples tied to nation states, whereas in the new world, where you have more of a conglomeration of different, immigrant cultures, it becomes a bit more hazy and complicated. But that is generally, in the traditional sense, one of the key defining features. Irredentism, revanchism. So the idea of they generally tend to share a common thread of feeling as though they are there to restore national glory. And so you do see that, for example, in some of the modern far American right-wing rhetoric. That's another common one. And generally a strong sense towards militarizing, towards military strengthening, towards military prowess. They had a big emphasis on sort of the strength and military might and power of their nation. And another common theme would probably be a strong sense of populism. So although the economic policies, and we'll get over how the economic policies of fascism changed over time and how they started in a very different position than where they were by the end, it still has a strong sense of using the state to do kind of glorification of the state. So monuments, symbols, ways to kind of demonstrate and speak to the glory of your own nation, but also in terms of using the state to kind of build industry and to industrialize. And to some degree, many fascist movements had a sense for worker protection, which is part of where you start to get into the socialist part of it. But maybe to kind of roll back just a little bit and just kind of talk about this development. In the early days, fascism was in part basically born out of that split and that idea that actually, we want to fight for workers' rights, but we are nationalists fighting for workers' rights. So we're like national socialists, right? Which is where you get to. And they actually, as it developed over time, they tried to present themselves as a third way, kind of between the battle between capitalism and socialism. And they said, look, you don't have to pick either of these sides. We are a new way of approaching economics and the struggle and these kinds of things. And we're going to focus more on these values of nationalism and national pride and national identity. Over time, and we'll get into this, the fascists found their most natural allies were the traditional conservatives, often monarchists though, right? So not necessarily totally laissez-faire, but often conservative, religious monarchists who viewed that national pride as very important and were very vehemently opposed to that internationalist anti-war element that fascism was also very opposed to. And so you'll see all of these fascist parties over time, they really lose the socialist parts of their like identity and their policy and structure, and they move into more of this really hard focus on the ethno-nationalism because they want to collaborate with the conservative forces. And this happens consistently in most fascist states that rise up.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, continue.
Okay.
That's good.
So I think there's one other part to sort of get into. I think that a lot of Americans don't fully get. And this is really important to when people have a misunderstanding. Because I grew up in America, right? And one thing I was always told is, well, the Nazis never won the vote. They only won 37% of the vote. But I think Americans don't understand a multi-party parliamentary system, right? And so in a multi-party parliamentary system, the way it works is essentially you have a bunch of parties on the list. They all get votes. They get proportioned seats accordingly. And it might be divided up by regions or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's essentially a proportional distribution of seats in parliament based on your proportion of votes. And you'll typically have a large number of parties getting smaller percentages of the vote. I think I live in the Netherlands now. I think here we have something like 13 to 18 parties in our parliament, right? And what happens is the largest, most successful parties get together and they form a governing coalition. So when you look at what they say, well, the Nazis never won the popular vote. When they won in 32, when they won 37 and 32% of the vote, they were by far the plurality, right? So the next highest was the SPD, the Socialist Partei Deutschland, the Soc Dems, with 20% of the vote, right? Okay.
Just quickly, your camera got out of focus.
There we go. It does that. I'm sorry.
No, that was perfect. Just caressing your beard did it. Okay, so that's a good kind of thing to debunk, is the initial step into power that they had was done legitimately. It was done through popular will. They didn't have a majority, but through the parliamentary system, they did have a plurality, and that allowed them to get into power completely legitimately. And then you'll talk about the kind of centralization of power that they enacted through those official means.
Well, let's take it a little bit further back, because I probably skipped a little bit ahead in the story. So I think, we don't have to go too far into Weimar and the start of that. But essentially, for the beginning period of the Weimar Republic, it's the SPD has seen what's happened in the Soviet Union and does not want that to happen there. So they take a very different approach from how the Soc Dems, let's say, in Russia took it. And it was also a different context. But this resulted in pretty much a constant battle between the Bolsheviks, so basically the anti-war socialists, the more hardline Marxist-Leninists who rebrand into what we now know as communists, and the Socialist Party, which are more like social democrats. Sorry, bringing it back even further a little bit, because this is important, very important, is the Treaty of Versailles. So the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles comes down. The Germans are excluded from negotiations. And this is not like the Second World War, where Germany was absolutely crushed and had to be unconditional surrender and there was no other option. This was a war which had been a grueling, bloody slog. And the Germans had known they'd lost, but they were still quite far up on the front. There was not like Germany was being invaded. This was a quasi-negotiated settlement as kind of popular will and feasibility of winning collapsed around them. And the Allies presented terms that were quite difficult for the German state to swallow without fully breaking up the state, right? So the first minister, the first sort of chancellor who had to go and sign the Treaty of Versailles literally resigned instead. So it was universally reviled. And it was three things that kind of hurt the Weimar going forward and this was a general popular sentiment, was prestige. So it felt very unpopular. It felt humiliating. They forced Germany to take responsibility for the war and the treaty, which they felt was unfair. It was the indemnities. So they were required to pay massive amounts of money to the Allies. I think it was estimated at one point to be about 1/3 of the economy. So this was crippling for the German economy and the quality of life within the early Weimar Republic, and the military restrictions. And now this becomes very important for the street violence we're going to get into, which is you had a massive mobilization, and then suddenly the Germany is restricted to 100,000 soldiers as active military, and that's it. And they can't run state-run paramilitaries or anything. So you have these huge numbers of trained soldiers who go, and they don't have a place to go. So the political parties in this early republic start forming large-scale paramilitaries, right? So essentially, because you can't have an official state army, the political parties are running their own armies. So the Germans, the Nazis had the Sturmabteilung, which is the SA, which is the forerunner to the SS. Brown shirts, famous for going through the streets and, you know, beating people and violence and all of that. The SPD had the Reichsbanner, whatever, basically Reichsbanner, red, yellow, red, gold, black, whatever. Anyway, point being, they had like a paramilitary as well as the Iron Front. That's where the famous 3 arrows thing comes from. And all of these, and the communists had them as well. And so all of these paramilitaries are basically young guys who are pissed off, who are out of the war, who are in this young republic, and they're literally fighting each other, right? And there's just extensive political assassinations, and there's extensive street violence. And so this SPD is kind of in control, but they're not really able to stabilize the country. And you get to, and in 1923, Hitler decides that, in his young Nazi party, thinks they're going to launch a coup. So they're not popular. They're not particularly well known at this point. They have Ludendorff, who was the old military dictator, essentially, during the war, who's kind of aligned with them. But they think we can get up together and we can, just like Mussolini marched on Rome and took control of the government, or the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took control very quickly of Leningrad and Moscow and seized power. We're going to do the same thing, and we're going to start in Munich. So they try and launch a coup, and they fail completely. A lot of the leaders get arrested. Hitler gets arrested. All of these guys get arrested. And from this moment on, they reform their tactics, and they say, we're going to start winning legitimately. And so Hitler writes Mein Kampf. He starts to build celebrity. He starts to really like gain a following. And then over time, they're slowly building power. They start toning down the anti-Semitism in their campaigning rhetoric because they realize it's not as popular. And they start really trying to present themselves as a real option. The Great Depression hits, just like the rest of the world, flattens Germany's economy again. And basically Hitler starts running on the idea.
Oh, you're about to do it. Perfect.
Yeah. So Hitler starts running on the concept of, hey, I'm here to restore the German economy. We're going to, uplift German workers. We're going to restore German prestige. We're going to rearm Germany. We're going to, basically make Germany great again. Unfortunately, that analogy is somewhat fair.
So it's a worker oriented, but also kind of restore law and order type platform.
Yes,
is that correct?
Exactly. Restore law and order, restore the health and happiness of the German people and the German workers. This is some of the initial rhetoric. And you actually have essentially within the Nazi movement a left wing. So within the SA, you have a guy called Ernst Röhm, and they have this idea of kind of almost like true national socialism, of the idea of we want to break down capital, we want to have a workers' revolution, but for white German people, right? And then you have the more conservative wing of the Nazi party as it's rising as well. And these are the people who are really more focused on ethno-state, nationalist glory, anti-Semitism. Not that the other guys weren't also focused on that, but they're more pragmatic on the, let's say, economically ideological side. So I don't want to be seen doing Rome apologism. He's also not a good guy. None of these are good people. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right. And so you're saying they toned down the level of anti-Semitism that we're familiar with, but there was still a heavy emphasis on this ethno-nationalism, and we're making our country great again by giving back to this certain group of people that are the important people.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. So in 1930 is probably the pivot point. So the SPD are still the largest party, but the Nazis win about 18%. But between the SPD and the communists, they could form roughly a coalition government. It'd be 40%, so it'd still be a minority government. But it's at this point, basically, it's a complicated government system, but basically they've been ruling with straight minority governments, like tiny percentage of the vote, like being appointed by the president and ruling by emergency decree. So the whole system's kind of breaking down. And so the SPD goes to the communists. Erich Dahlmann was the leader, and he's at this point fully in bed with the Soviet Union. And he says, look, let's form a coalition government. Let's stop Hitler, because this rise of Nazism is antithetical to what we both believe in. And let's try and form a government together. Erich Dahlmann tells him basically, no, and fuck yourself. Sorry, I can swear on this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Erich tells him, no, and fuck yourself. And his basic perspective is they believe that the Soc Dems were the primary enemy. And they actually believe that once Hitler starts gaining power, it's going to drive people to the Communist Party, and they'll finally be able to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. They call the Soc Dems social fascists, because they call everyone else fascists, and they call the Soc Dems social fascists. At this point, the relationship between the communists and the fascists is really it's bad between everyone, but these two are like fundamentally oppositional to each other. So 32 rules. So again, you have another minority government because no coalition can be formed. Of just basically, there's a kind of, let's say, a center-right party called Centrum. They're getting a member of that party is getting appointed chancellor to run the country by emergency decree, because nothing can be done in parliament. 32 rolls around. Hitler wins the biggest vote in the first election, 37%. No one wants to form a government with him. So they do run another election. Hitler wins 33%. So at this point, Centrum and kind of, let's say, the more center-right parties and the monarchist parties, they come together and they view Hitler still as sort of this buffoon. And they think we can kind of control him. You know, this is like a silly party. We're going to just sort of use him, and we're going to make him our tool, and we're going to convince Hindenburg, who's the president. So very quick sidebar, parliamentary system. You have the head of government and the head of state are two different roles. Like in a constitutional monarchy, the king is the head of state, but the prime minister is the head of government. In a republic version, the president's the head of state, and the chancellor is the head of government in Germany. So they convince Hindenburg, who's the president still, the head of state, look, we're going to form a cabinet, appoint Hitler as the chancellor. Franz von Papen was his name. He's from Centrum. I'll be the vice chancellor. We're going to form, we'll control him. We'll tone him down. We'll keep the socialists out of power. They hate the communists. We hate the communists. Perfect. So they form this government. And this is where we get to centralization. 4 weeks later, the Reichstag fire happens. So basically the main, like a little bit like the U.S. Capitol, if it got set on fire. Okay. And so there's a lot of speculation. It's still unknown for sure. There's a lot of speculation. This was a fascist, a Nazi false flag. But we don't know. What we do think, the official narrative is that a Dutch communist basically burned down the fire. But what Hitler did in that moment is he said, okay, well, this is a national crisis, right? And so he talked to Hindenburg. Now, Hindenburg has been ruling essentially they've been governing through emergency decree for a while. So they get Hindenburg to pass an emergency decree, which basically outlaws communists, right? So not the socialists yet, but the communists. So
but remind me, didn't you indicate that the communists were? You weren't saying that the communists and like the Hitler ilk were working together, but instead the communists were standing to the side, didn't want to unite with the Soc Dems to stop Hitler. Is that the point you made earlier? Okay, so
basically, the communists still viewed the Soc Dems as the primary enemy, the primary barrier.
Gotcha.
And they viewed Hitler as a tool that would make them more popular. Because once they realized how buffoonish this man was and whatever, and how awful this party is, they'll all come running.
As people expected here. Gotcha.
Yeah. The Hitler and the monarchists and the more traditional conservatives all hated the communists a lot, and then hated the SPD somewhat.
Gotcha.
Right? So that's kind of the weird dynamic you have going on. So Reichstag fire, he gets Hindenburg to pass a decree which outlaws communism, and immediately the fascists, the Nazis, just turn it on. So as soon as this law gets passed, or this decree goes up, they start mass arrests of communists. They start banning the Communist Party. Then Hitler thinks, now that we've suppressed communism, we can throw snap elections. I can get over 50% of the vote finally. And we'll kind of send brown shirts out there, suppress the vote, blah, blah, blah. So they run snap elections. At this point, it's getting a little rigged, but he's taken power legitimately at this point, right? And he's banned the communists through means that are pretty much legal in how the country has been governed thus far.
Because it already was in this kind of
fucked up situation.
Messed up situation. Gotcha.
And they were the largest single party, right? And they created a coalition with another party, the sort of the center right to the old fashioned right, and they created a government. So they ban the communists. They do another election. I think they end up with like 44% of the vote, which Hitler was actually kind of disappointed and surprised by, because given all their voter suppression tactics. And they make a deal with the basically all the other types of conservatives, and they say, look, we want to take full control. We want you to pass the Enabling Act. So the Enabling Act basically allows Hitler himself to rule by decree, doesn't need to pass anything through the parliament, can just basically do whatever he wants. At this point, this law is probably unconstitutional, but the Republic is so young that like some of these checks and balances and some of these traditions aren't quite as ingrained as you might have in an older Republic, right? So he makes guarantees to the kind of moderate right that they will be allowed to continue to be a political party in this new structure, that there will be protections for religion, that there will be protections for da-da-da-da-da. And they all come on board. So the communists are not allowed to vote because they technically still have members. They won a bunch of votes, but they can't be seated. I think they're all in exile in Prague at this point. The socialists all vote no, and the moderate right and the Nazis vote yes. This basically gives Hitler more or less control to do mostly whatever he wants. When Hindenburg, the president, dies, he uses his powers in the Enabling Act to merge the two offices and becomes essentially, as we know now, der Führer. So this is kind of the process that they follow through using existing, and this is part of their strategy from the beginning, was using essentially existing political processes to consolidate and gain and control power, and to win to some degree electorally, which you could argue they fairly won in both elections in 33.
Wow. Okay.
Or 32. Sorry.
So to the thing that because this has just been bouncing around in my head. One of the things that has been thrown at me before is, no, Nazis were really socialists. And as you're identifying, there was this broad swath of worker appeal related parties that were trying to give some sort of power back to the people. But the brand of socialism that we now think of today, that is left wing, also socially and kind of in all of its values, is completely uncomparable to the level of like, yes, we're pretending to be pro-worker, but it's all driven out of this like ethno-nationalism. This is right wing social values and stuff like that.
I think one thing to maybe call out quickly is, as I should have mentioned this as well in 34. As Hitler is consolidating power, he needs to appeal to the existing power structures at this point, right? So he's appealed to the moderate parties, but he also wants to appeal to the business leaders, the business community, to kind of get them on side, get them on board. So at this moment, and he's also concerned about the SA, because the SA, the paramilitary organization, at this point, they feel to him like a relic of kind of the past, of the dirty fighting, right? Of the stuff that he campaigned to end. And he's got new structures like the Reichswehr and other kind of military and policing and political structures to wield now. And the SA is really where you have that sort of more ethno-nationalist, socialist style sentiment building, right? And Rome at this point is advocating, now we need to have our social revolution for the German people. So the Night of the Long Knives happens, where Hitler pretty much purges all of the meaningful, powerful, more socialist fascists out of the party. So the Nazi party from 34 onward doesn't really have any socialist elements. It's still called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei, but it's not a socialist party from that moment on. Really, I would say if you look at Mussolini, you have more of that element of that lifting up of workers, of Italian workers, right? Obviously, white Italian workers, white non-Jewish Italian workers, but you do have more of that worker focus. Really, I think by 34, the Nazi Party is pretty much a state capitalist, pro-business, like corporatist entity when it comes to economic policy.
Interesting. So interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that hits most of my major notes. I don't know if there's any other questions you have on the topic.
Yeah, from your understanding, let's say that you were trying to answer the question. Here we go. One of the questions I got asked was, when would violence have been justified from people standing up for the oppression of Jewish people in that era? So when did the violence being afflicted by the Nazi Party and by the people in power rise to a level that violence would have been justified from the other side?
I mean, in some ways, it's a moot point because there was violence from the other side the entire time and it did nothing, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, I take your point, but I think there's a fantasy that Vaush had about, violence is the only way we could have stopped this or solved this. The violence helped contribute to this. They were not able to assassinate Nazi leaders. These guys have huge paramilitary organizations protecting them, right? They were able to assassinate minor Nazi officials, right? There was physical violence in the streets. It literally only made people more upset and more uncomfortable, right? And they were searching more for strong law and order, not workers' revolution at that point, because they were concerned for their own safety. So, I mean, you can ask when it's morally justifiable, and I would say, again, I mean, it's a tough question because at the end of the day, like, they were doing it the whole time and it didn't work.
Right. So that, great answer. And I do think, obviously, we can all look at specific cases and say, if you were ever being attacked yourself, like, of course, go ahead. But from like a broad societal prescription, trying to think about the way we're going to take back, quote unquote, which I hate that phrase because it's used in a disgusting way, but like the way that we're going to rid our country of like a really dangerous movement is to rise up violently, is, to me, has always struck me as a very like baby brain understanding of how these takeovers happen, how these horrible acts of violence by people in power happen. And so with that being said, if you now, hindsight 2020, looking back at those number of years, what, if anything, could have been done to avert the crisis that ended up happening? Is it just like one of those parties would have had to unite with another to actually get popular support and stay in power in the government?
I would say, and this also is maybe to a degree a difference between us and the rise of Hitler, is I would say all the parties involved needed to realize how serious Hitler was, a serious person and a serious threat. And, some people will try and make the allegory to Donald Trump today and say, yeah, but no one, he also is viewed as a buffoon. Yes, but he's also viewed seriously, right? Especially, I think, after he was president for 4 years, he's viewed as a serious thing and someone that can be very destabilizing to the republic, right? And most of the people, pretty much until the moment he started just completely grasping full control, really viewed him as a serious, he's the backward Bavarian guy. He's a corporal in the army. He's a runner. He makes good speeches, but he doesn't know how to govern. He's not a serious person. And
I think the comparison is less from the country as a whole, but you do see even to this moment, this attitude from what would be applicable to that modern, and I'm not making the comparison of like Trump's as bad as Hitler. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying a lot of times it is moderate people of the same ish side of like the aisle, if you want to call it that, who stand by, who make excuses, who they're just kind of a buffoon, that allow that individual to grab enough power to do a certain amount of damage. Again, I don't think the two are comparable, but in that sense. But we have seen it is the moderate Republicans, except for the Cheneys and the Kinzingers and stuff like that, who even with all of the January 6th stuff, say like, oh, this just seems like a distraction. This is just a bunch of political stuff, like Trump, blah, 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 blah. And they do make excuses for how serious of a moment that was. So I see why people compare that. Like, this is what happens when quote unquote serious but moderate people sit back and allow things to happen and make excuses for the more dangerous part of their party.
Yeah, I mean, you can
movement.
see a corollary between the way let's say the free market, more traditional, but also like the more traditional conservatives in Germany, like von Papen and Schleicher, I think, like looked at, if we work with the Nazis, we can gain power and we can control them. So that part of it, you can see that a little bit with the far right wing in America. I think there are much stronger checks and balances in the American government than there were in the Weimar Republic. I also think some of the real anti-Semitism, virulent anti-Semitism, while it still made some people uncomfortable, was a far more normalized perspective than, let's say, some of the really hardcore ethno-white nationalism that you have in the extreme right fringes in America. Like the general American society is not as accepting of that, even if you have, pockets and you have 4chan and whatever the fuck.
Right.
Like you have pockets of the general mainstream is far less accepting of that than the American mainstream is, I think, of that same.
I guess right? So the comparison that he was making, and this is where I get into like an intellectual stressed out moment, is whenever I think about some of the rhetoric that you see from very prominent mainstream figures like Tucker Carlson, and you think, I agree that our institutions as they currently stand have better checks and balances and are stronger than those that you laid out just now. But like, if you were to be on the way to something horrible, you would definitely start with the stuff you see from Tucker Carlson, the constant dehumanization of immigrants, the constant, sure, we have to take back our country and real American culture, and like legacy Americans are being replaced and all this. That is the rhetoric that preps someone's mind to think violence is justified. And a poll came out recently showing that I think like 20% of Americans, most very high Republican percentage, believe that violence is necessary to take back our country or something like that. And the reason they believe that is because they're being told that like their heritage and their race is being replaced by immigrants. And so how do you kind of square that with what should be the strong actions? And is it what I said? I know I'm going on for a while, but that the only chance we have of avoiding something horrible, if we're on the way to that right now, is gonna be getting mobilizing that popular support that we already have. Because like you said, America does have better views on a lot of these issues than in Germany at that time. But is our only chance to get in power through those official means, get in power through mobilizing public opinion, and stop them using the institutions?
Yeah, there's a stream on the far left in like at least online discourse where they basically just go, ha ha ha, electoralism, you fucking nerd. And it's like, well, you're not, I have two thoughts on that, which is one, you're not proposing any kind of feasible alternative.
Gosh,
and
yeah.
the other point is, I think that one thing that, so having kind of lived in multiple types of government and seen multiple styles of government working, the American political parties are in reality more like what coalitions are in Europe. Now, the difference is the party apparatus is on a coalition basis rather than on an individual party basis. But if you look at the Democratic Party, let's say you've got, the far left's kind of adjacent sitting in there. You've got like, Southern black folk who have their own vested interests and their own kind of priorities. You have Northern urban progressives. You have various different groups who would in other countries often probably be their own individual political parties, right? Same thing in the Republican Party. You've got the business conservatives, you've got the evangelicals, you've got the, proto-American fascist nonsense, which I wouldn't call them full fascist by any stretch of the imagination, but you've got some of those proto signs there. And so these are essentially ruling coalitions of different parties. And so how it really works in the American system is you've decided what coalition you're in, but you need to get your party to win the primaries, right? That's really what I think that, I understand the progressive left, and I'm also a very progressive person. You know, I'm probably a social democrat as well. So, like, you know, I'm not necessarily happy with the very moderate streak that there are in large parts of the Democratic Party, especially on economic stuff, which is, you know, as an economist myself, it's more what I care about. But to say, well, yeah, look, it's so moderate, it's useless, they're just trying to fuck us. It's like, well, you know, activate in primaries. Go build a movement in the primaries. Get your progressive candidates to win primary elections, and then it's the coalition against the coalition after that.
Yes.
You got to get your candidates on the ticket for the coalition. That's all it is.
Honestly, I think nothing enrages me more. I spend all day reading and then covering far-right people, and it enrages me. Yes. But because it's my own team, my own team, when I see progressives saying, like, electoral politics is stupid, we should give up on it, oh, the flame inside of me is brutal. Because that is the way, and I was just having a discussion with someone who, you know, we had a great discussion, but he was expressing that sentiment of, like, why even vote? What's the point if they keep not doing what we want? And the point I was making is, no, because we haven't been voting, they've been not doing what we want. Because we don't have enough progressives who are activated, that is why we keep getting these moderate candidates. Because at the end of the day, in our current system, our politicians actually do, if we scream loud enough, have to answer to us. Yes, money plays a big role. Yes, all of that, you know, special interests mess a little bit with the system. But at the end of the day, a bunch of people do have to write that select that individual's name on a ballot for them to stay in power, and that's what they care about. At the top of their list is to stay in power. And so if enough voters were read up enough where they know which candidates are, you know, too beholden to certain interests, and they went and voted in primaries according to that information, we would see a shift very quickly. The issue is, for some reason, the response from a lot of people to seeing our system not work correctly right now is to detach from the system. But the only solution is the exact opposite, to get more involved, because we're the only people who want to fix, or who can fix the system, if we're the ones identifying the problems with it.
Correct. Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, there are the point of a Republican government is, at least to some degree, to be responsive to its people. Now, there are problems in American democracy with oligarchy, with centralization of money, with the amount of money in politics. I mean, if you compare to other countries, I find it wild, right? Like, even in the UK, you've got publicly funded elections. I think you're only allowed to campaign for 1 month, whereas the American election goes on for 2 years. Like, one election is done, you start the next one.
Definitely.
But at the end of the day, you have it exactly correct. I mean, any basic civics lesson will tell you that, you know, there are these mechanisms in place for the government to be responsive to the people. And if you're unhappy that your fucking senator won't end the filibuster, which is a ridiculous policy, and an undemocratic policy, then primary him. You know, then fucking campaign for their primary opponent. That's the whole point of the primaries. You are electing your party to your coalition seat. Right. That's what it is.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And we've talked about that on the show too. In most other democratic countries, you wouldn't see like AOC and Joe Manchin being in the same party. And when you think about it, like, you're laying it out there, being the primaries is where you fight for your party. If you were thinking in the context of other countries, then once you get to the general, you have to unite with the coalitions that vaguely are on your side. And people don't do that. Like, we have terrible numbers when it comes to primary turnout. And that is when you really get to express your values through your voting. Yes. Because when you have two options that are so far from each other, speaking of the general election, you get to vote, you get to, let your feelings be known, but through a very limited scope. In a primary, you have tons of options. You can go very specific, and people aren't involved enough. And so I think while we have to address the problems with our systems and institutions, really the only way we're going to do that is to have people in those systems and institutions who believe what we believe, to make those solutions, happen. But there just seems to be a lot of complacency, and I'm not blaming, like, you would hope that politicians would just be goodwill and do what's best all the time. But if we're not forcing them to, you honestly can't blame people from acting in their best interest so they can get that bougie lobbyist job after. Like, we do have to be responsible at some point. And that is how we're going to stamp down any potential dangerous far right uprising or like rise to power.
And I am absolutely willing to entertain other options than electoralism, but I'm not willing to entertain you telling me electoralism. Oh, you think we're just going to vote harder? It's like, well, give me a good idea that's alternative. And by the way, going out into the streets and killing people, as we saw from the Weimar Republic, and actually also from the conditions in Italy, we don't need to get too deep into that, but there was also a lot of street violence in Italy before Benito Mussolini took power. Street violence seems to often beget fascism. So, give me some other option, and I'm happy to entertain it. I would love to see things get better, but as far as I can tell, electoralism is the only real choice.
Right. That's so fascinating, because one question, when I went back and watched Vaush and I's debate, one question I wish I had asked, because he was doing a good job of asking me questions that would kind of put me in a situation where I wasn't able to give the best answer. I wish I had asked him, give me an example of like fascism is on the rise, a genocide is about to happen, and then a violent uprising happens and everything's, hunky-dory. Like that saves the day. That's very interesting.
Real quick, after the Enabling Act passed and like Hitler basically had sole control, he completely crushed and stomped down all structures that could possibly show resistance. I mean, I think in 1934 they had like 100,000 political prison arrests and 50,000 actively incarcerated political prisoners, right? So before they came for the Jews, they came for the communists, and the communists were armed. You know what I'm saying? So like,
wow.
It's a very clear example of them very actively targeting a armed militant group and completely and fully suppressing it.
Wow. Gosh. Yeah. That is fascinating. All right. Well, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, I tweet about esports and history sometimes. It's twitter.com/canechurch, C-A-N-E, church. It's an English translation of my last name.
Gotcha. Well, I'll put that in the description for anyone watching this when it's uploaded later. I appreciate you. Quite knowledgeable, very fascinating, and fun to talk to. So thanks for coming on.
No worries. I appreciate you having me. This was a lot of fun. And hopefully we'll talk again.
Absolutely. All right.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Luke. Bye.
Thanks.